Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a really interesting topic today.
Yeah, it's a big one.
It is. We're going to be looking at who's actually doing science these days and
Right.
how that's been changing over time.
Yep.
We've got this really cool research article. It's called Young Male and Female Scientists, a quantitative exploratory study of the changing demographics of the global scientific workforce.
Catchy title, right?
I know, but don't let that scare you away because we're going to break it all down for you today. And we're really focusing on the world of STEM. That's science, tech, engineering, math, and medicine all rolled into one.
The whole shebang.
Exactly. And there are some really interesting trends emerging, especially when it comes to women in these fields.
Absolutely. The research really digs into that.
So, you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Okay. So this study gives us a really in-depth look at the global scientific workforce.
Yeah, they looked at a huge number of scientists.
Huge. Like how many?
We're talking 4.3 million scientists from 38 different countries.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
It is. And these are all developed nations, the OECD countries.
Okay, so that's like, the US, Canada, most of Europe.
Exactly, the places you typically think of when you think about, cutting-edge research.
Gotcha. So they looked at everyone who's ever published a scientific paper in these countries?
Not every single person.
Okay.
They focused on researchers who had at least 3 published papers.
Ah, okay, so like the serious scientists, the ones who were really committed to their work.
Right. They wanted to focus on the folks who are truly invested in science, not just dabbling.
Makes sense, like you said, 4.3 million is a lot to sift through.
Exactly. They had to narrow it down somehow.
So what did they find? Are we seeing big changes for women in STEM?
Yeah, there are definitely some things that pop out right away.
Okay, like what?
One of the first things was just how much of the research is related to medicine.
Oh, really?
Almost half of all the scientists in this study, close to 46%, are involved in medicine somehow.
Wow, nearly half. That's way more than I would have guessed.
It is a big chunk, yeah.
So is medicine just a naturally bigger field, or is there something else going on?
It's probably a mix of things.
Okay.
Medicine is definitely a huge field, tons of different specialties, but also seems like it attracts more women compared to other STEM areas.
Interesting. So the fact that so many women are in medicine, that's probably changing how we see the overall representation of women in STEM, right?
Absolutely. If we don't look at each field individually, we might get the wrong idea.
Makes sense.
For example, think about computer science, engineering, math, physics, the big four, as they're often called.
Yes, the classic STEM fields. And those have historically been male-dominated, haven't they?
Exactly. And unfortunately, those stereotypes are still around today.
So things haven't really changed in those areas.
Well, the study found that in 2021, women made up less than 20% of the scientists in each of the big four.
Yikes. Less than 20%. That's not great.
No, it's not. But there is some good news, I promise.
Okay, I'm all ears.
What they're seeing is that younger generations of scientists tend to have a higher percentage of women across most STEM disciplines.
So there's hope for the future.
Definitely some bright spots.
Yeah.
Like in engineering, for example, the percentage of women in the youngest group, those with like 5 years of experience or less, was more than double that of the older groups.
Wow, double. That's a huge jump.
It is?
But I can imagine it can still feel pretty lonely for women in those male-dominated fields, especially for those who've been around for a while.
Yeah, you're right to point that out. In the past, it wasn't uncommon for women in engineering or physics to be like the only woman in their whole department.
Oh, I bet that was tough.
It must have been. But this new wave of women coming in, it's starting to change things.
So things are slowly getting better.
We're seeing more women, which hopefully means a more supportive and inclusive environment.
That's good to hear. But are things changing fast enough to really close that gender gap?
That's the million-dollar question. Based on what they found, getting to a perfect 50-50 split in those big four fields could take close to a century.
A century? Wow, that's discouraging.
It is a long time. But maybe instead of aiming for perfect parity, we should think about gender balance.
Gender balance, what's that?
Instead of 50-50, it's more like a range between 40% and 60% representation for each gender.
Okay, so neither gender dominates.
Exactly. And some fields, like medicine and agriculture, they've already hit that balance.
Oh, that's good to know.
And others are getting there, steadily making progress.
So maybe focusing on gender balance is a more realistic goal.
It's definitely more achievable in the short term.
Right. So we've talked about medicine, the gender gap in those big four fields, and this rise of young female scientists.
Lots of big trends.
Yeah. What else did they find in this mountain of data?
Well, one thing that came up is how we define young scientists, and it might not be as simple as you think.
Oh, interesting. What do you mean?
We've been using that term young scientist, but we haven't really explained it. This study, they didn't just look at someone's age. They categorized scientists by their academic age.
Academic age. Okay, now I'm curious.
It's the number of years since they published their first research article.
Ah, okay.
So a young scientist in this study could be someone in their 30s or even 40s who got into research later in life.
So it's not about how old they are, but how long they've been doing research.
Exactly. And when you look at it that way, some interesting patterns emerge.
Like what? I'm intrigued now.
Well, one thing they found is that in almost all fields, most of the female scientists are concentrated in those younger age groups.
The ones with less experience.
Yeah, meaning they've been publishing research for less than 10 years.
So more women are entering the field, but it sounds like they might be leaving at higher rates too, especially as they get more experience.
That's a really important observation.
It is.
It's great that more women are coming into STEM, but we also need to figure out why they might be leaving, especially as their careers progress.
Yeah, we need to keep them there. Retention is key. It definitely feels like we're just scratching the surface here.
We are. This study gives us a broad overview of what's happening globally, but we need more research to really understand the experiences of women in STEM on a more personal level.
Yeah, what are their specific challenges? What kind of support do they need to succeed? Those are important questions.
Absolutely. It's not enough just to see the numbers. We need to hear the stories behind those numbers to get the full picture.
Well said. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's come back to the study. Are there any other limitations we should keep in mind?
A couple of things. First, focusing on OECD countries means we're only seeing part of the picture.
Oh, right. There's a whole world of research happening outside of those countries.
Exactly.
And I imagine using published articles as the only measure of participation could be problematic too.
You got it.
Like, what about all the researchers who are doing great work but not publishing in journals?
Exactly. There might be women who are teaching, taking care of family, or just lacking the resources and funding to publish.
Right. Their contributions are important even if they're not showing up in this analysis.
Exactly. So this research, it's really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, it's revealing these big trends, but also sparking even more questions.
Absolutely. But it's a really important step towards understanding this complex world of STEM and how men and women are navigating it.
I'm ready to dig into some of the finer details of this study, but let's take a quick break first.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into the changing world of STEM.
Stay tuned.
Don't go anywhere. Okay, so we're back and ready to unpack even more of these fascinating trends in STEM. Before the break, you mentioned that the researchers use two different ways of looking at the data, what they called a horizontal view and a vertical view. I'm ready to hear more. What exactly are those?
Right. Those two perspectives, they give us a really helpful way to kind of slice and dice all this data. Let's start with the horizontal view.
Okay.
So this one, it's all about comparing men and women within the same age group, but across different fields.
So like we're looking at all the scientists who've been publishing research for, say, 5 to 10 years, and then seeing how many are women versus men in each field.
Exactly. And when you look at it that way, some interesting patterns start to emerge, especially when you zoom in on those younger groups of scientists.
Okay, so like the up-and-comers.
Right, like in medicine and biochemistry, for instance. We see this clear trend where as you look at younger and younger groups of scientists, the percentage of women just keeps going up.
Oh, that's great. So more women are joining those fields with each new generation of scientists.
That's what it looks like.
I'm guessing that trend isn't universal though, right? Not all STEM fields are seeing that same kind of progress.
You got it. When you look at those big four fields we talked about, computer science, engineering, math, and physics, the story is a bit different.
Oh, right. Those fields are still struggling to attract women.
Even when you look at the youngest age groups, the gender distribution is pretty much the same.
So those stereotypes and biases, they're still having a big impact, even on the younger generation.
It seems that way, unfortunately.
So the horizontal view shows us how things are different across fields.
Exactly.
What about the vertical approach? What kind of insights does that one offer?
All right, so the vertical approach. This time we're looking at how the scientists are spread out across different age groups within each specific field.
So now, instead of comparing men and women of the same age in different fields, we're looking at how they compare within a single field but across different age groups.
You got it. So instead of comparing across, we're comparing up and down.
Makes sense.
And that's where things get really interesting. When you look at the data this way, you see that in pretty much every STEM discipline, most of the female scientists are concentrated in those two youngest age groups, the ones with less than 10 years of experience.
So even though there might be more women starting out in STEM, they don't seem to be sticking around long enough to become like senior researchers, the leaders in their fields.
That's exactly it. It's fantastic that we're seeing more women entering STEM. But if we want to see more women at the top, we got to figure out why they might be leaving, especially as they get more experience.
Yeah, we need to understand what's happening along the way.
Retention is key. Getting women in the door is a great first step, but we need to create environments where they can actually thrive and build long-term careers.
It's like we can't just focus on recruitment, we need to focus on support too.
Absolutely.
So those horizontal and vertical views, they give us a much more nuanced picture of the data.
They really do.
Did the researchers look at how these trends have changed over time too? Like, has there been any progress in the last few decades?
Oh yeah, they did. They looked at data all the way back to 1990.
Wow, that's a pretty long span of time.
It is. And looking at that long-term view, you can see some clear patterns. First, the good news? The overall percentage of female scientists has been steadily increasing across all STEM disciplines.
So progress is being made.
It is. But, and there's always a but, the rate of change, that's where things get interesting.
Uh-oh, what do you mean?
In those big four fields, computer science, engineering, math, and physics, the increase in female representation has been way slower compared to other fields.
Oh, so those stubborn patterns are still there.
It seems like it, and we're talking about a pretty long time frame here, almost 3 decades of data.
Yeah, so it's not just a recent blip, it's a persistent problem.
Definitely. There are some deep-seated issues at play in those big four fields that we need to address.
It sounds like we need a much deeper understanding of why those fields are lagging behind.
We do. And that brings us back to something we touched on earlier, the need for qualitative research.
Right, the research that goes beyond just the numbers and really explores the lived experiences of women in STEM.
Exactly. We need to hear their stories, understand their challenges and triumphs to really get to the heart of these issues.
So quantitative studies like this one, they give us the big picture, but we need those personal narratives to figure out what's really going on.
That's exactly it. It's all about connecting those dots.
Okay, so we've looked at those horizontal and vertical views. We've seen how these trends have been playing out for decades now.
Lots of information to process.
It is. Are there any other key insights you think our listeners should know about?
There's one more finding that I think is really important, and it's a positive one.
Okay, I like the sound of that. What is it?
It has to do with the decreasing isolation of female scientists, especially in those traditionally male-dominated fields.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, remember how we talked about how it used to be pretty common for women in fields like engineering or physics to be like the only woman in their entire department?
Yeah, and how challenging that must have been.
It's hard to even imagine how isolating that must have felt.
It really is.
But here's the good news. This influx of younger women we've been talking about, it's starting to change that dynamic.
You mean because there are just more women in those fields now?
Exactly. The study shows that in those big four fields, the percentage of women in the younger generations is way higher than in older generations.
So women entering those fields today are less likely to experience that same level of isolation.
That's what the data suggests.
It's still a tough road, I'm sure, but at least they're not alone.
Right. And while it doesn't erase all the challenges, having that visibility, that sense of community, it can make a huge difference.
It makes me wonder what those trailblazers, the women who did face that isolation, what they would think about these changes.
I know, right? What would their advice be to young women starting out in those fields today?
It's important to remember those who came before and learn from their experiences.
Absolutely. That's why research that focuses on the personal stories of women in STEM is so crucial.
We need to hear those voices, understand their journeys, to create truly inclusive and supportive environments where everyone can thrive.
Well said. It's about making sure STEM fields are places where everyone feels welcome, valued, and empowered to do their best work.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have. Medicine, the gender gap, those horizontal and vertical views, even this trend towards an aging scientific workforce.
It's been a whirlwind.
So where do we go from here? What's the key takeaway message for our listeners?
Well, one thing is clear progress is happening, but there's still work to do.
We can't get complacent.
No, we need to keep pushing for more equity and inclusion in STEM.
And this research, it's helping us figure out where to focus those efforts.
Exactly. We've seen that it's not enough just to get women into STEM. We need to create spaces where they can stay, where they can grow and advance in their careers.
To all our listeners out there, keep thinking about these issues. Keep the conversation going.
What kind of future do we want to create for STEM? And what can we do to make that happen?
Those are great questions to ponder.
Let's keep exploring.
Until next time, stay curious, everyone. Decreasing isolation, huh? That sounds like a good thing. What did the researchers find?
Well, think about it this way. In the past, it was pretty common for women in fields like engineering or physics to be like the only woman in their whole department.
Yeah, like one woman in a sea of men.
Exactly. And you can imagine how tough that must have been, how isolating.
Oh, yeah, I bet that was really hard.
But the good news is things are starting to change.
Oh, that's good to hear. How so?
Well, with more women entering STEM, especially those younger generations, that isolation is starting to decrease.
So they're not as alone as they used to be.
Exactly. They're more likely to have female colleagues, mentors, people they can connect with and relate to.
That makes a huge difference, I bet.
It does. And while it doesn't erase all the challenges, it definitely creates a more supportive and inclusive environment.
Right, they're not the odd one out anymore.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, what those women who did face that isolation, what they would think about these changes.
It's like they paved the way for the next generation.
They did. They were the pioneers, the trailblazers.
It would be fascinating to hear their stories, what they learned, what advice they would give.
Absolutely. Those personal narratives are so valuable. They give us a much deeper understanding of what it's really like to be a woman in STEM.
It's like the numbers tell us one story, but those personal stories, they fill in the gaps.
Exactly. And they can inspire us to create even better, more inclusive environments for women in STEM.
It's about making sure those fields are truly welcoming to everyone.
And that's what it's all about. Making STEM a place where everyone feels valued, supported, and empowered to succeed.
Wow, this deep dive has been incredible.
We've covered a lot.
We have medicine, the gender gap, those horizontal and vertical views, even the aging scientific workforce.
It's been a lot to take in, but I think it's been really insightful.
So where do we go from here? What's the big takeaway for our listeners?
Well, the biggest takeaway is that progress is being made.
But we still have a long way to go.
Definitely. There's still a lot of work to do to achieve true equity and inclusion in STEM.
And research like this, it helps us understand where to focus our effort.
Exactly. It shows us that we need to do more than just attract women to STEM. We need to create environments where they can thrive.
Where they can stay and build long-term careers.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for change.
What kind of future do we want to see for STEM? What role do we play in making that happen? Think about those questions and keep the conversation going. Until next time, everyone.